waiting in line. As I approached the Peace Tower at the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, I saw it, a line of orderly, polite, patient Canadians, waiting. Without a word, I joined the line and many more followed. The young man in front of me carried a backpack large enough to carry 4 weeks of food and clothes. He looked like a student, and I imagined he had come a long way to stand in this line. An old soldier wearing a uniform covered in medals bypassed by the long line. With the assistance of a family member, he went straight to the front without incident. As he passed, I could only smile at him. The woman behind me, who had just arrived from work, approached the RCMP officer on duty. She returned to tell the rest of us, "It will be about 20 minutes. I suppose I can wait 20 minutes for him," she said with a smile. "He did give his life for us." Several of us murmured in agreement. The Ottawa papers had been full of it. A Canadian soldier who had left Canada on a First World War troopship had died in France in 1917, and his name had been lost forever. 4 years ago the Royal Canadian Legion embarked on a mission to bring him home, and a few days ago his remains had been exhumed and then carried to the Vimy Memorial in France by a French honor guard. In the emotional ceremony that followed, he was turned over to a Canadian honor guard. Then this soldier with no name was flown home to Canada in a maple casket covered in a Canadian flag. Tomorrow, Sunday, May 28, 2000, his remains would be laid to rest at the Canadian War Memorial. But today he lay in state in his flag-draped casket on Parliament Hill, to be honored by all Canadians as a hero. The 27,500 Canadian mothers who lost their sons at war this century and never knew where their bodies lay, would now have a place to come. As we waited in line, the flag on Parliament Hill flew at half-mast and the Peace Tower bells tolled the quarter-hour a dirge for Canada's war dead, sending chills up and down my spine. I was so proud to be a Canadian that day as I paid my respects. The number of people there astonished me. For me it was a very personal pilgrimage, but it was for thousands of others as well. As I stood in line I wondered, could this passionate display of quiet respect happen anywhere else? When I reached the doors, I climbed the steps. The last time I had climbed those steps I was a wide-eyed child taking my first tour of the Parliament buildings. But all tours were cancelled on this special day. Instead, I was greeted by a very young cadet who gave me a pamphlet that told the story of the unknown soldier and his long journey back home. As we entered the Hall of Honor and drew close, suddenly all conversation in the line stopped, and we stood in silent awe and reverence. 6 soldiers in full dress uniform from all the divisions of the Canadian military protected his remains. Keeping a 24-hour a-day vigil, these soldiers, men and women, young and old, stood surrounding the coffin with heads bowed in respect for their fallen comrade. Clergy members from all religions including the First Nations communities participated in the vigil. Flowers and wreaths from Prime Minister Chrétien and Governor-General Adrienne Clarkson along with many others cascaded over the casket. Many other visitors had left poppies behind. The image was overwhelming. A veteran signaled the student in front of me to proceed to pay his respects to the unknown soldier. As he walked forward I suddenly realized that I was at a funeral unprepared. I didn't have a poppy or even some tissue. As I waited, my anxiety built and I wondered, what do I do? What do I say? How long should I stand there? These questions rushed through my head. The nod came from the veteran and I moved unsteadily forward. My anxieties disappeared as I entered into his sphere. What I did was unimportant, my presence was paramount. Suddenly I became aware of all the energy in the room. It wasn't just sorrow or remorse, it was pride. The energy washed over me like a wave. In that moment I knew I was not alone paying my respects, my whole family was there behind me. My great-grandfather, who fought in both world wars, stood beside me and saluted. My grandfather, who was killed in World War II, held my hand. Although I probably only spent a moment there in front of that coffin, in many ways it was a lifetime. As I left, I signed the registry for all of us. Over the 3 days he lay in state, 10,000 Canadians waited in the line to pay their respects to the unknown soldier. The next day, during an emotional hour-long ceremony, the unknown soldier was lowered into his final resting place at the Canadian War Memorial. An honor guard of the Royal Canadian Regiment fired 3 volleys as the coffin disappeared into the new tomb for the unknown soldier. In silence the audience watched as a silver cup containing soil from the unknown soldier's former gravesite in France was emptied over the coffin. A parade of veterans representing Royal Canadian Legions across the country followed, scattering soil from every province and territory onto the coffin. 9 buglers played the last post and Ottawa held 2 minutes of silence. Then, 4 CF-18 fighters thundered past overhead, and by the time "O Canada" was sung, most of the audience was in tears. When I got home, I called my grandma in Uxbridge and recounted every little detail of my time waiting in line for the unknown soldier. I needed a hug from her. And even though we were far apart, we shared a virtual hug over the telephone lines. On that day, I learned how very proud I am to be a Canadian. This inspirational story and many others can be found in Chicken Soup for the Canadian Soul. Jack Canfield, Mark Victor Hansen, Janet Matthews, and Raymond Darren, eds. Chicken Soup for the Canadian Soul, I Florida, Health Communications Incorporated, 2002.